Think about the last time you fought to stay awake. Maybe it was a late drive. Maybe a boring meeting after lunch. You felt your eyelids getting heavy, and you did what humans always do. You fought it. You rolled down a window. You pinched yourself. You told yourself just a few more minutes. Now imagine that feeling arriving without warning. You're walking to the store. You're milking a cow. You're a child sitting in class. And the heaviness comes, but this time you don't get to fight it. You simply drop. And you don't wake up for 2 days. When you finally do, you can't remember falling. You have a splitting headache, and the people around you are terrified because you are the 4th person this week that it's happened to. This is not science fiction. This happened over and over in a real village to real people for years. And you've probably never heard of it because when the world did briefly notice, it slapped a spooky label on it, a cursed sleeping village, and moved on. But the real answer is far stranger than a curse, because the thing putting an entire village to sleep was invisible. It was silent, and it had been building underground for decades, waiting. Here's what actually happened. Here's what the evidence says, and here's why the most terrifying dangers are almost always the ones you can't see coming. The village is called Kalachi. It sits in the northern steppe of Kazakhstan, in the Akmola region, roughly 230 miles from the capital. By the numbers, it is deeply unremarkable. A small farming settlement of somewhere between 500 and 700 people, mostly ethnic Russians and Germans, surrounded by flat grassland in every direction, the kind of place where nothing happens, which is exactly what made what started happening so impossible to ignore. In the spring of 2013, people in Kalachi began falling asleep. Not tired, not drowsy, asleep suddenly and completely in the middle of whatever they were doing. A person would be walking down the road and simply crumple. A woman collapsed while milking. Children dropped at their school desks. And these weren't naps. Victims slipped into a deep unconsciousness that could last for hours, and in the worst cases, up to 6 full days. You could shake them, shout at them, even get a mumbled word out of them, and then they would sink right back down into sleep. When they finally surfaced, the aftermath was its own nightmare. Splitting headaches, nausea, dizziness, a weakness that lingered for days, and memory loss, a blank space where the collapse should have been. Some people described feeling drunk, stumbling and slurring. And here is the detail that pushed the village toward panic. It wasn't random and one time. The same people fell asleep again and again. Some victims went under more than half a dozen separate times. Over the following 2 years, more than 140 people were affected. In a village that small, that is not an outbreak. That is nearly everyone knowing someone who is dropped. Question: if your neighbors started falling asleep mid-sentence and waking up days later with no memory, and no doctor could tell you why, what would you start to believe? Because that's exactly the vacuum this created. With no explanation, the stories rushed in to fill it. Some villagers spoke of a curse on the land. Others whispered about the hallucinations, because a number of the sleepers didn't just black out, they saw things. One child reportedly described a winged horse. Another spoke of a snail crawling across their face. Adults reported vivid, dreamlike visions during their episodes. To a frightened community with no scientific answer, hallucinations plus mass unconsciousness sounds a lot like something supernatural. And the media, when it arrived, leaned into exactly that framing. Kalachi became the village where people can't stop sleeping, a mystery, an enigma of the steppe. The strangeness sold. The explanation, when it eventually came, did not. Because the explanation wasn't a ghost. It was geology and human history and basic chemistry quietly conspiring beneath the villagers' feet. To understand it, you have to go back to the Soviet era. Kalachi did not spring up in the middle of empty grassland by accident. It was built next to something, a uranium mine, part of the sprawling Soviet nuclear program. The nearby settlement of Krasnogorsk existed to serve that mine, and Kalachi sat right alongside it. For decades, men went down into the earth and pulled uranium out of it. And then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mine, like so much of that infrastructure, was simply shut down and abandoned. Now, the first instinct and the first theory investigators chased was the obvious one: uranium mine, radiation. Surely the village was being slowly poisoned by radioactivity seeping up from the abandoned shafts. It's the explanation that feels right. It fits the spooky narrative perfectly. And the evidence killed it. Teams measured the radiation. A television crew found one filled-in shaft with elevated readings, but everywhere else, in the village, in the homes, in the places people were actually collapsing, the radiation levels were normal. Kazakhstan's own nuclear scientists confirmed it. Whatever was happening in Kalachi, it was not radiation sickness. A former miner put it bluntly: people had worked in those mines for years and no one ever fell asleep. So investigators kept digging, and this is where careful science slowly beat a good scary story, because the answer turned out to be hiding in what happened to the mine after it closed. When the uranium mine was shut down, it was abandoned, and abandoned mines don't stay empty, they flood. Groundwater seeped in and filled the tunnels, and those tunnels were full of old wooden support structures, timber that had been holding up the shafts for decades. Now picture what happens next, deep underground, in the dark. Wood, submerged in water, in an enclosed oxygen-starved space, begins to break down. And that slow decay, combined with the mine's chemistry, started producing gas. Specifically, it produced carbon monoxide, along with other hydrocarbons. And critically, the process was consuming oxygen out of the air down there. Carbon monoxide is the perfect villain for a mystery like this, because it is engineered by nature to be undetectable. It has no color, no smell, no taste. You cannot see it seeping. You cannot smell it pooling in a room. It gives no warning at all. And it does something horrifyingly specific inside your body. It binds to your blood's hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen, roughly 200 times more strongly than oxygen itself. So when carbon monoxide is present, your blood starts grabbing the poison instead of the oxygen, and your organs, above all your brain, begin to starve. The early symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning read like the Kalachi diaries word for word: headache, dizziness, nausea, confusion, and, as the brain is deprived, overwhelming drowsiness, loss of consciousness, and afterward, memory gaps. Even the hallucinations fit. Oxygen-starved brains produce exactly that kind of vivid, dreamlike distortion. Here's the mechanism the investigation settled on. Under certain conditions, weather, pressure, wind, the gas building up in the flooded mine would migrate. It would seep out of the ground and drift, invisibly, toward the village. And as it did, it displaced the breathable oxygen in the air. Kazakhstan's deputy prime minister eventually stated it plainly. The mine was releasing carbon monoxide. The oxygen in the air was being reduced accordingly, and that was the real reason for the sleeping sickness. The episodes came and went because the gas came and went, riding the conditions above the mine. That's why it struck some days and not others. That's why the same person could be hit again and again. They weren't cursed. They were standing, unknowingly, in an invisible tide of poison that rose and fell around them. Now, in the interest of honesty, this is not a perfectly sealed case. Some scientists pushed back. A pulmonologist at Duke pointed out that in open outdoor spaces, it can be hard for carbon monoxide alone to reach concentrations high enough to knock people out, and suggested other gases, carbon dioxide, methane, or a combination, might share the blame. That debate is real and worth respecting, but the core finding held. The culprit was gas from the flooded mine displacing oxygen and poisoning the people above it, not the supernatural, not radiation, a chemical process set in motion by a decision to abandon a mine unfolding silently for years. And the response tells you everything about how seriously the authorities came to take it. They didn't perform an exorcism. They didn't seal a cursed door. They evacuated the village. Families were relocated, dozens at first, then more, moved away from the invisible thing rising out of the ground. You do not relocate an entire community over a superstition. You do it when you understand, finally, that the land itself has become unsafe to breathe. Now step back and notice what this story is really about. The people of Kalachi were being harmed by something with three properties. It was invisible, it was silent, and it was slow. There was no monster to point at, no dramatic moment of attack, just an ordinary village, ordinary days, and a threat that gave no signal until people were already collapsing. That combination, invisible, silent, slow, is precisely the kind of danger human beings are worst at fearing. We are exquisitely tuned to react to the sudden and the visible, the snake, the fire, the scream. We are almost blind to the gradual and the odorless. And that blindness isn't just about gas. Think about the slow dangers in your own life, the ones that give no dramatic warning, the habit that's quietly compounding, the small resentment settling into a relationship, the health symptom easy to explain away, the debt growing a little each month. None of them announce themselves, none of them crumple you in the street. They work exactly the way that gas worked under Kalachi, patiently, invisibly, until the effect is impossible to ignore, and you find yourself wondering how you never saw it coming. The villagers of Kalachi weren't foolish for reaching toward a curse. They were doing the most human thing there is, trying to put a face on a threat that had none. The real lesson of their sleeping sickness isn't that the world is haunted. It's the opposite, and it's more unsettling. The most dangerous things rarely look like monsters. They look like nothing at all, until you understand what you've been breathing. So the next time you feel that heaviness pulling at your eyelids, you'll almost certainly just be tired. Fight it or don't, but spare a thought for a small village on the Kazakh steppe, where the pull toward sleep wasn't tiredness at all, and where the people learned, the hardest way imaginable, that the quietest frets are the ones worth watching for. They couldn't see it, they couldn't smell it, they only knew it was there because one by one they kept falling asleep.